You know, I talk a lot on this channel about modern racing games, especially those that I feel have underdelivered or failed to innovate in the last decade. But something I haven't done as much is highlight games that I genuinely thought stayed good or always innovated on their formula. Games that I grew up with and would dump hundreds of hours into after coming home from elementary and eventually middle school. While we didn't have a whole lot of money growing up, I did have a surprising amount of access to video games. This mainly came from my dad spending a fair amount of money on the consoles we did have at the time, namely an original Xbox and a PS2, but those weren't the only places I did most of my gaming. Even though we didn't really have a personal computer at home, and when we did I usually didn't have much access to it, I did spend a large amount of my time growing up playing computer games, because both of my grandfathers actually worked as computer technicians for their job, and both had a corner in their house specifically for all their computer junk, where I'd sit for hours and usually end up breaking something. But I wasn't just playing any computer games because, again, we didn't have any money. The only real, CD-based PC games I remember from that time was Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, one of the most cursed train wrecks of a game that I loved playing. No, my time was spent on a very different type of game, Flash games. Flash games were such a weird internet phenomenon, and they still kind of are. Macromedia Flash was one of the biggest early content creation tools, which gave users the ability to make animations, illustrations, and games all in one relatively simple to use program. Tons of websites sprung up around Flash games. Congregate, Miniclip, Addicting Games, Kizzy, Not Doppler, A-Game, Box 10, Free Online Games, Armor Games, Cool Math, and how could I forget arguably the most important side of this era, Newgrounds. It even got to the point where some websites started specializing into hosting specific types of games and content, like Ninja Kiwi with its primarily tower defense and balloons games, Nitrome, which focused on very well done pixel art games with very simple controls and great presentation, and Stickpage, which focused on the ever popular Stickman games. But throughout all this, there is one fact that often gets overlooked about this era of Flash games. That being that not all these games were made using Macromedia Flash. Many of the more simplistic games, or games that were made for sites that didn't support Flash, were actually made in HTML. Many of the notable 3D games of this era were made using Unity. And another 3D engine that's important to this video is the Shockwave engine, which has a long and complicated history. It was actually being developed by Macromedia around the same time they were developing Flash, and throughout its history it would be under Macromedia, Adobe, Addicting Games, Viacom, and Defy Media at various points. But in 1999, they launched Shockwave.com to both promote Shockwave and other Flash games. And Shockwave.com would go on to be one of the biggest browser game sites of the 2000s. But the history of Shockwave is only one half of the background for the games I'm covering today. For the other half, we need to go to a rather big town in the center of the Netherlands. In the early 2000s, two then teenagers, Diederik and Pieter, met at the Utrecht School of Arts, where they bonded over their shared interest in classic games like the ones they played on the original NES or Commodore Amiga. In 2004, the two decided to partner together and make their own game studio, to make games in the same vein as the action-focused titles they grew up with, but adapted to 3D. Their first officially released project, The Hammer, came out in 2005 and was made to be an homage and adaptation of GTA 3, but available in just an internet browser. While I wouldn't call it an incredible success, it and a few other titles did get the ball rolling for the company going into the late 2000s. Then, from 2007 to 2009, they started up 3 new series in a genre they hadn't really done much of up to that point: racing games. The first was Burnin Rubber from December 2007, which I'll get back to in a moment because it's the main focus of this video. Next was Traffic Slam in June 2008, which doesn't really constitute as a racing game, because it's basically just an answer to the question, what if the crash mode from Burnout 3 and Revenge was its own game? Which, as it turns out, is a really fun idea for a short little browser game. But like many other browser games, it is content limited, having only a single car and track to go around with, although later installments would add a lot more content and new mechanics. And lastly was Rally Point, which was basically, what if we took the racing from Burnin Rubber and mixed in a little Motorstorm and Colin McRae Dirt, which was also a pretty good time, and has the most entries of any Xform series with 6. But I should probably start talking about Burnin Rubber first. Now, to be frank, Burnin Rubber 1 and sorta 2 aren't really that much to write home about. Like, playing through these first two, I beat BR1 in under 20 minutes and 2 in under 40. And that was less because of it having more content and more so that there was just a massive difficulty spike near the end of the game. These games were very content limited, which makes sense for a Flash era game, but knowing what the later games would accomplish, it's still a little bit disappointing with the games having only 3 and 6 cars respectively and an equally low number of unique tracks. Although credit where it's due, this was where many staples of the series such as the physics, the boost and point mechanics, and the general presentation of the series were established, being heavily inspired by the Burnout series and with the gameplay drawing from Need for Speed. Actually, the series as a whole draws so much from Burnout 3 Takedown in particular, so much so that the HUD from BR1 is actually the same as Burnout 3's. If you're gonna try either of these games, I would go with Burnin Rubber 2, but with 2 major caveats, that being that the game does have some weird physics, where even the slightest disturbance in the road can send your car flying or spinning in unpredictable directions. Also that, as of writing, this is the only Burnin Rubber in the mainline series that is yet to have an official re-release, so you're gonna have to find it elsewhere. Now, if the series had ended here with these 2 games, I probably wouldn't be talking to you about them now, but the next game is where things really got interesting. This right here, this is the reason I'm making this video. And I mean that in a very literal sense, as this was both my introduction to the series all the way back in 2010, and it's also still my favorite of the series. Let's start with the basics. This game is much larger than the last 2. It took me over 2 hours to beat the game over 2 sittings, and an extra hour just to get all the hidden collectibles, meaning a less experienced player could easily spend a good few hours going through all the game's 51 levels, plus a daily bonus challenge, giving it well over triple what Burnin Rubber 2 had, and it equally increases the car list, going from 6 to 16 cars, including a semi-truck, a tank, and a damn Apache attack helicopter. They also added customization to the game which, although primitive, only adding a single modification per type, and not allowing modifications on boss cars, was still cool to see in a game like this that you could just pick up for an hour in your browser. There was another change they made between this game and BR2, which was this. Yeah, they added various weapons you could now attach to your cars in the same style as games like Twisted Metal or Full Auto. And as expected, it completely changes the dynamic and feel of the gameplay. The cars themselves also feel a bit tighter on the tracks, and the tracks themselves actually feel a bit wider, meaning the races themselves are more engaging than before. Also, like I mentioned previously, they added in proper boss battles, meaning you can also earn extra good cars during the progression, which leaves you with even more money to buy upgrades with, another thing BR3 introduced. You also get this cool globe map, which is very reminiscent of the level selector from Burnout 3, although the rest of the game is stylized with the primary font from Race Driver Grid. And I'm generally a really big fan of the really over-the-top styling of everything else in the game, especially with the weapons and how ridiculous they are to use on the track. Although, with that being said, this obviously isn't a perfect game. It has a number of notable issues. Like the last two games, there can be some weird moments with the physics engine, meaning you could easily lose a race simply by being screwed over by a funny ramp. The graphics obviously aren't the best either, but again, this was meant to run on the browsers of PCs still running Windows XP. It obviously wasn't going to look as good as, say, Hot Pursuit 2010. And the standalone release of the game has a few visual bugs, and during my 3 hours of playtime, crashed about 3 times. Now, 3 crashes in 3 hours might sound like a lot, and it kind of is, but I'm more willing to excuse that for 2 reasons. One, like I've said, browser game, and 2, I actually spent about 45 hours over 2 weeks in early March doing a full playthrough of Fallout New Vegas, unmodded, so crashing only once an hour seems pretty good coming from that. Great game, runs like a paraplegic with arthritis even on a PC as good as mine. But back to Burnin Rubber 3. There are also a few things that aren't as objective, but that I still found a bit annoying. Like the music in the game, while fine for what it is, did get repetitive fairly quickly, and there's only a handful of tracks in the entire game, as well as the general sound design feeling kinda flat and mono. Except for the explosion sounds, because they obviously had to make those sound nice and crisp. All in all, while I still think this game is ridiculously impressive for something as seemingly simple as this, it's even more impressive when you remember it was made by just 2 people, passionately taking ideas they liked and mixing them together to create something wholly unique. And I can really get behind that, especially since that's basically how I think of my own channel. But I'll talk more on that later in the video. For now, we need to get to Burnin Rubber 3's sequel, Burnin Rubber 4. Actually, before we get to Burnin Rubber 4, I want to make a quick mention of another game Xform came out with around the same time. That being Redline Rumble Revolution. Remember this, it will come up later. Then, in August 2010, we finally got Burnin Rubber 4, which was another notable jump in the series. Now, instead of being a linear series of levels all in different locations, it's now a fully open-world collectathon with a bunch of different items, events, and tickets as the main form of progression. Now, the tickets are a neat idea that makes the progressing through the levels a bit more engaging than just a direct sequence of events. It's like the comparison some have made with the hacking minigames in Deus Ex Human Revolution, or the hacking minigames in Fallout, or the hacking minigames in Mass Effect. Like, the act of progressing didn't need an extra layer tacked onto it which gets old after the 7th ticket, or the 3rd terminal. But the tickets in Burnin Rubber 4 are basically just level unlocks scattered around your map, and instead of beating levels unlocking more levels or even new cars and upgrades, they unlock special events, and those help you unlock new cars and also new areas. Yeah, this game isn't just open world, but it has several distinct locations you can actually go and explore, as well as the races, which are comprised of both locations from the open world and reused maps from BR2 and 3. Although, when it comes to the open world map itself, there's basically like 4.5 maps, and I'll explain why that is in a bit. Although outside of the new collectathon progression, this really isn't all that different from Burnin Rubber 3. Again, the physics are improved by a bit, there's more cars and weapons. They did actually remove the visual customization in favor of adding more livery options, which, seeing how some of them looked in 3, was probably for the best. And they also changed what you could drive. Oh, you thought The Crew was the first racing game that let you drive boats and aircraft? Nah, Xform was doing that half a decade before Ubisoft got to it. Granted, I think the earliest game that let you do this kind of stuff was still like GTA 3, but Burnin Rubber 4 is one of the earliest examples I can find of it in a racing game. And that's still impressive, seeing that at this point it was still just 2 guys. Actually, at the time, these innovations and improvements were enough to earn Burnin Rubber 4 Game of the Year on Shockwave.com, which they celebrated with a re-release of the game a year later with some added content, which is where that extra island I mentioned earlier comes from. It's not much smaller than the other 4 main areas, but it just doesn't have as much content or any of the tickets there like the others do. But even then, this was and still is the longest game in the series. Easily a 4 to 6 hour game if you don't know where the tickets are, although it does drag a little if you can't find the tickets or certain events, so you have to be on the lookout while exploring. This game also has a few more fundamental issues. A smaller one being that I personally like the presentation of 3 a bit more, especially visually, but 4 is still plenty serviceable. More importantly, the recent standalone release of 4 that I'm playing is noticeably less stable than 3's. Like, the number of freezes or crashes I experienced in 4 was nearly doubled from 3 over the same time, which wasn't helped by the aforementioned increased runtime of 4. But on the whole, Burnin Rubber 4 was still plenty enjoyable in my opinion. Right there next to 3 is my favorite in the series, but it would be some time before they were actually able to iterate on the series again. I do want to make a small note about something. Around this time, Xform actually expanded and added a few more developers onto the team, but within a few years would downsize again back to the primary 2. As well as a few others here and there that would come in to help with assets or music. I would be more exact about this, but I wasn't able to find much concrete information on exactly what the timeline looked like for all this, so I'm just including it here. My best guess as to when they cut back on staff was around 2015, because their number of new releases plummeted around that time. But before that, we got the next entry into the Burnin Rubber series, Burnin Rubber 5. And BR5 is a weird one for multiple reasons, starting with the fact that there are so many versions of this game. The first officially released version of Burnin Rubber 5 was in April 2013 and was made using the Shockwave/Adobe Director engine, which got a remaster and porting to Unity in 2018, which was eventually dubbed Burnin Rubber 5 HD, and also was the only Burnin Rubber game brought to Steam. Then, in 2020, we got a pair of re-releases called Burnin Rubber 5 XS and Air, respectively. Air was a heavily simplified version of the full game available in internet browsers after the original became basically unplayable, and HD was only available on Steam or Xform's itch page. It was also split-screen multiplayer only, meaning you had to have 2 people to play it. A couple months later, XS came out, which was very similar to Air, but this time being single player only. These both were made using Unity. There was also a secret 5th version which was never publicly released and I don't think was ever planned to be, which was the iOS tech demo that actually predated the official release of the game by about a year. Yeah, it was all just a bit of a mess. But for the purposes of this video, the bit that you should be concerned about is that I played Burnin Rubber 5 HD for this. I did also play a little bit of XS, and it was alright, and I tried playing the original back in the day, but it was actually too difficult to run on my granddad's computer back then. The HD release is probably the most technically sound of any game in the series, and it's one of the first to properly support full screen and resolutions higher than 1080p. Which I guess makes sense given its title. The game itself doesn't look all that different texture and model-wise, but the lighting has been improved massively. And by that I just mean they use the regular lighting a lot of 3D game developers on Unity use, giving it what I call the mobile game bloom, which is different from something like 7th gen bloom, like on the games from Rockstar or Codemasters in the late 2000s. This difference is mainly in how harsh and contrasty the modern lighting can be, but I can't honestly complain too much knowing the lack of budget and staff the team had to make any major adjustments. Similar to the graphics, the physics were also overhauled, but in a bit of an odd way. See, I personally think these cars do drive a lot better, as now they have a real sense of weight to them, and you actually have what feels like vaguely realistic inertia. So they're good to drive, it's just that many tracks are still far too narrow to take proper advantage of it. Although this is also where stuff like the drift button comes in handy, which is something I really only had to use before in the very first Burnin Rubber, but that also added to the dynamics in races. And speaking of changing the race dynamics, they both added more weapons into this installment and added a new weapon type in special weapons. I'm gonna be 100% honest, and this is gonna sound like a dig at the game, but it's not. These weapons reminded me of merging karts and Crash tag team racing, which isn't a bad thing in this case, because I enjoyed how it was implemented. It's just unfortunate that's the game it reminded me of. On the campaign side, it is a little shorter than BR3 and 4 were, but it makes up for that in content variety and having probably the best pacing of any game so far. Although they did go back to the linear design of the older titles, ditching the open world from Burnin Rubber 4. From an objective standpoint, this is probably the best in the series so far, but something about it just doesn't hit for me like the last two do, and I think that's in its presentation. While this game does feel cleaner than the last two, I guess it just doesn't feel as unique as they did, even if that unique quality came from the ideas they borrowed from other properties at the time. But I think this, 3, and 4 are still the games I would recommend at least trying from the series. And right after Burnin Rubber 5 came out, we got two weird spin-offs from the franchise. The first being Burnin Rubber Crash and Burn in October. It marketed itself as a tribute to Burnin Rubber 4, which I'm assuming meant 4 ended up becoming the most commercially successful at that time. But in reality, what this was basically the main map from Burnin Rubber 4, with the gameplay being a mix of Traffic Slam, as well as that one mission from GTA Vice City where you literally just blow up as much stuff as possible. It's a neat little idea, but nothing super groundbreaking here. The other game came out in December and was called Burnin Rubber Shift. Okay, you remember the drag racing from the early Black Box era Need for Speed games? And how almost everyone criticized them for feeling way too sluggish, inconsistent, and at times way too difficult? This game basically answers that with, what if all the cars were as stiff as a brick and turned instantly on a narrow strip of road? And also the game was kinda bullshit, but that's not the only interesting part about the game. See, remember that game I stole H-Bomber Guy's bit in foreshadowing earlier? I mentioned that because the history behind this game is linked with that game. Because this game has its physics, gameplay, and most of its car models taken from that game, which itself is actually a remake of a game from 2003 called Redline Rumble. And that game was a reskin of a game made by an RC car company promoting their recent line of RC cars they launched for Too Fast, Too Furious. This is stupid, way too complex of a history for a game this simple, and I love it. But after this, there was a bit of a drought in new Burnin Rubber games, and we wouldn't hear anything about them for a number of years. It was almost 10 years before we would hear anything new about the franchise. But then, in March of this year... That's right. They confirmed they were starting work on the next full installment in the franchise. And like many fans of the series, I'm really excited to see what they cook up next with this. But this actually hasn't been the only Burnin Rubber thing they've been working on. As I said before, in 2018, they started making standalone releases for the games now that browser support was beginning to decline. Starting with 3, 4, and 5 in 2018, Burnin Rubber 1 in 2020, and Burnin Rubber Crash and Burn in 2022. Also in 2022, they released Burnin Rubber Multiplayer, a relatively simple game which basically takes the driving and shooting from the other games and merges it with some Battle Royale style gameplay, having better weapons and pickups scattered around the map, and basically all of its maps taken from Burnin Rubber 4. It does have a fair bit of jank, like a friend of mine figured out how to turn on a dime by spamming the drift button, and when I got in a lobby with a handful of dudes from my Discord server, we figured out what the weapon meta was within an hour and started spamming OP weapons. Oh, that's how this works! Hello, Sunday.
I can't fire this thing.
Fuck!
Oh, that was... I had, like, legit track you down with that. Oh, shit. But we still had some good fun, especially with a fuller lobby. And as of now, that's where the series stands. Would I say these are amazing, groundbreaking games that are essential plays for anyone who missed them? No. Frankly, these are still very bare-bones games with a number of significant issues, and all these games put together, sans maybe the multiplayer game, could be completed in just a couple days by a more active gamer. But I always think that's part of why these games are as enjoyable as they are. Because these games don't have the most complex campaign or mechanics, don't have the best driving physics, and certainly don't look the best. They're just fun video games, with ideas that anyone can understand and get invested in, even if only for a few hours. And that short length also helps the games not feel as repetitive, because I'd much rather have this than the grind of games like Project Cars 3, Need for Speed Unbound, or Forza Motorsport, because those games start with some good ideas that feel repetitive after hour 5, while by hour 5 in a Burnin Rubber, the game is over. And these games also don't feel like they were squeezed out of the corporate tube of a multi-billion-dollar company. They feel like they were made by a small group of passionate people trying to mix together ideas they liked while doing their own thing with it, which I can really relate to because that's very close to how I treat my own content in my channel. Going back to the start of this video, I talked a lot about the golden age of Flash and how that era was, but an even more important aspect of that era which carried over into the modern content landscape was the sense of community and shared ideas, and how the synthesis of ideas is one of the best ways to make something great. And I think this series is one that exemplifies that ethos, and I appreciate it even more thinking about it on those grounds. This might not be the best racing game series of all time, but it is one of my favorites, and it's been that way for over a decade. So if you do want to give it a try, I'd say probably start with Burnin Rubber 5 HD since it's on Steam, and it, along with the majority of the other entries, are up on their itch.io page, both of which will be in the description. While I'm not being paid to promote them, I personally like the idea of promoting a small indie studio, and if you'd like that too, then their itch page is probably the best place to do it. And there's some other cool games that they have on there too. I also want to give a shout out to Daniel and Knox from the Legacy Shockwave website for helping preserve many of these games and others that would have become lost media over time, and for helping me learn the history of Xform. Although I will also add a disclaimer to maybe not join the Legacy Shockwave Discord because it's probably better you don't know. But back to Burnin Rubber, I think despite its flaws, it exemplifies many of the areas that modern racing games feel like they're lacking. If only something like this could be given a proper budget and a couple more original ideas. Actually, you know what? I think I might have something in mind. Check back with me in a month, or if you're watching afterwards, check the link after the music list, and I'll see you there.